When the origins of the Göktürks are traced back through the surviving evidence, a clear pattern appears almost immediately. The earliest accounts rarely separate memory from myth. Real political events, blurred recollections, and symbolic storytelling sit side by side, sometimes in the very same paragraph. That mixture is not simply a problem of style, it shapes the entire historical debate. Because the sources speak in different voices and because each tradition preserves its own priorities, modern interpretations often depend on which records are treated as the main guide. Even when every available text is gathered, a single final answer remains difficult. Place names shift across centuries. Dates can be argued from more than one angle, and the language of the chronicles often demands interpretation rather than simple quotation. What survives is not a clean report, but a set of windows, each with its own distortion. Yet comparison still produces a firmer outline than any one source can offer alone. Up to the year 542, the strongest shared conclusion places the Göktürks around the Altai region, especially along the southern slopes and the connected steppe corridors. Chinese records in particular frame them as related to the Huns, not as a sudden new nation appearing from nowhere, but as a branch emerging from a wider Hun world. In these descriptions, Göktürk groups are positioned north of earlier Hun zones, then later concentrated more clearly toward the southern edge of the Altai. This matters because it gives the story a stable geographic core. Long before the Göktürks are described as empire builders, the Altai appears as a dependable point of reference, one of the first places that can be identified with cautious confidence. Even that conclusion, however, does not erase the legends, and it should not. The mythic sections are not reliable in a literal sense, but they are not empty either. Origin stories often preserve the kinds of details that formal chronicles overlook. Remembered migrations, older place names, and symbols that later become political tools. Dismissing the legends entirely risks losing that layer of meaning. In Göktürk tradition, no symbol illustrates this better than the wolf. It is not only a tale of ancestry, but a political language that later elites used to describe identity, legitimacy, and belonging. Wolf-linked names appear in later life, attached to people and groups. Claims of special connection to that symbol also appear in elite circles, suggesting that the wolf image functioned as a marker of the ruling core. Over time, it becomes less a folk-tale motif and more a statement about who stands at the center of power and why that center deserves to rule. Within the sources, two main origin narratives stand out. The first is the best known, the wolf ancestry account. It begins with catastrophe. A community is defeated so completely that almost no one survives. Only a single boy remains alive, abandoned in a marshland and left for death to finish what war began. Then the story shifts in tone. A she-wolf finds the child, protects him, and keeps him alive. In the next stage, the wolf becomes the source of renewal. Children are born, and the shattered line is rebuilt through descent. Danger returns, and the wolf is forced to flee. She leads the surviving bloodline to a distant refuge, often described as a remote mountain setting where a hidden valley offers safety, pasture, and isolation. The valley is more than a landscape detail. It is a symbol of protected growth, a place where numbers can increase away from enemies and away from the main roots of steppe politics. From that refuge, the descendants multiply into separate clans. The story then reconnects them to the larger world. After generations of isolation, they emerge again and become subordinate to a dominant power of their time. This part is important because it introduces hierarchy. The Göktürk ancestors are not yet rulers. They are dependents, living in a world where stronger confederations control the steppe. The sources also attach a practical identity to them: ironworking. They are described as working with iron, a detail that later writers use to explain both their economic role and the way others look down on them. Enemies sometimes portray them as servants rather than equals, people useful for labour and craft, but not yet fit for sovereignty. In the logic of the legend, that insult becomes part of the transformation. The group grows, produces leadership figures, gains confidence, and eventually becomes strong enough to challenge the power it once served. The narrative ends where political history begins. A people once reduced to near extinction becomes a force capable of building rule. The second origin story begins in a different direction and carries a different mood. Instead of focusing on survival after massacre, it places the beginning farther north, beyond the old Hun lands. The emphasis is on an unusual lineage, half human and half mythic, in the way early steppe genealogies often are. A leading family produces several brothers, and one brother is described as distinct from the rest, linked to the wolf in a special manner. Rather than being rescued by a wolf, this figure carries the wolf connection as part of his nature. He is also portrayed with mastery over natural forces, able to summon wind and rain. This is not simply decoration. In origin legends, control over weather often functions as a symbol of sacred authority, marking a founder as someone whose power is larger than ordinary leadership. From this starting point, the story spreads outward through marriage, descendants, and branching lines. The landscape in the narrative is dominated by rivers, severe cold, and distant mountain regions. Children appear as founders of separate groups, each associated with a river system or a particular mountain zone. The repeated emphasis on extreme cold, northern waters, and remote valleys suggests a memory of the Siberian and Upper Yenisei worlds, a far northern setting beyond the normal horizons of Chinese court geography. Read beside real geography, the most reasonable interpretation is that the northern land points toward a broad region north of the Altai, around upper river basins and forest-steppe transition zones. The story does not fit easily with locations far to the east or deep inside northern China. The landscape described does not match those regions well, and the names preserved in the sources do not align cleanly with them. Alongside the better-known myths, some historical records preserve a third line of explanation, one that attempts to link the Göktürks to political events in the Gansu corridor, particularly around the Pingliang region. For a time, this idea was treated by some scholars as solid evidence. According to that view, the Göktürks descended from elite families connected to a local regime that collapsed during the 5th century. At first glance, the argument appears convincing because it fits a familiar pattern. Steppe powers often emerge from the ruins of earlier political structures. Yet when the biographies, migration accounts, and narrative histories are examined carefully side by side, the connection weakens. The same sources that describe the fall of those Gansu-based rulers also explain where their followers went afterward. In most cases, the routes described lead south and west, toward places such as Shanshan and Turfan, rather than north into the Altai Mountains. This does not rule out contact, exchange, or even limited movement toward the steppe, but it does suggest that the Pingliang theory cannot serve as the primary origin story. Instead, it reflects a broader historical tendency. Many groups connected to the Han legacy continued to live in northern China, and later, writers naturally tried to link rising steppe dynasties to earlier Han-centered states. The impulse is understandable, but the evidence does not outweigh the Altai-centered model. When the material is considered as a whole, a cautious but coherent picture emerges. The Göktürks belong to the wider Hun inheritance, forming as a distinct branch within the northern steppe world. The most reliable geographic focus that can be identified is the Altai region, particularly its southern slopes and surrounding corridors. Beyond that point, the narrative moves into legend. Yet even the legendary elements echo themes that later became concrete markers of Göktürk identity, especially the prominence of the wolf symbol and the recurring idea of a protected place of origin, followed by outward expansion. From this stage onward, the record gradually becomes clearer because the Göktürks move from the realm of origin stories into documented political action. Their first secure appearance comes in the early 540s, when Chinese reports describe raids and pressure along the frontier. These accounts suggest a familiar steppe pattern: seasonal attacks, rapid withdrawals, and a preference for mobility over prolonged engagement. Defensive responses relied heavily on deception and psychological tactics, rather than open battle, implying that the attackers were fast, adaptable, and dangerous, but not yet overwhelming in sheer numbers. Shortly afterward, a decisive shift occurs. Diplomatic contact begins with a major Chinese state, signaling that the Göktürks were no longer regarded as a minor raiding group, but as a rising political force. In the years that followed, their strength increased rapidly, driven by the submission of large steppe populations. The balance of power across Inner Asia began to tilt. At the heart of this transformation lies a familiar steppe dynamic, a subordinate group reaching the point where it no longer accepts its place beneath an overlord. Once the Göktürks believed they had achieved parity, their behaviour changed accordingly. They demanded recognition, pursued political marriages, and presented themselves as equals. When they were dismissed or insulted, they answered with force. The outcome was the collapse of the older steppe empire that had dominated the region for generations and the formal emergence of a new one. From that moment forward, the Göktürks cease to be an origin puzzle. They become a historical actor, shaping events through negotiation, warfare, and the construction of an imperial system that would redefine Central Asia. In the mid-6th century, one individual stands at the centre of this dramatic rise: Mukan Khagan. Under his leadership, Göktürk power did not merely expand in territory. It reshaped the political structure of Inner Asia and forced the Chinese states to rethink their entire strategy of survival. Mukan's reign marked the moment when steppe politics and Chinese statecraft became tightly interwoven. Initially, relations between the Göktürks and the northern Chinese states remained fluid and uncertain. The growing closeness between the Göktürks and northern Qi alarmed Western Wei, which feared encirclement and isolation. This anxiety soon translated into action. Determined to prevent a lasting Göktürk-Qi alliance, Western Wei dispatched a highly skilled envoy to Mukan's court. The mission succeeded. After negotiations, Mukan chose to favour Western Wei over his eastern partners. The decision was made visible through ritual and symbolism. The Qi envoy was detained, while the Western Wei representative returned home with honours and elevated rank. This shift, however, did not amount to a clean break. In the same year, gifts continued to pass between the Göktürks and northern Qi. The ambiguity was intentional. Mukan did not seek loyalty from either side. He sought advantage. By keeping both Chinese states uncertain, he increased his leverage over both. While managing diplomacy in the south, Mukan pressed relentlessly against older steppe rivals. The remnants of the Rouran Confederation were hunted down without pause. After a final defeat, their leaders fled into Chinese territory. Mukan immediately demanded their return. Thousands were handed over and executed. With this act, the Rouran ceased to exist as a political force. The last serious rival to Göktürk dominance on the steppe was eliminated. As Göktürk power grew, fear spread across northern China. Massive construction efforts were launched to repair and extend the Great Wall. Hundreds of thousands of labourers were mobilised. New fortresses and garrisons appeared across the frontier. These measures were not symbolic gestures. They were acknowledgements of vulnerability. The following year became one of the most decisive turning points in Göktürk history. Campaigns were launched in every direction. The Khitan were defeated and forced into submission. The Kyrgyz in the north accepted Göktürk authority. In the west, the Hephthalites were crushed, likely through coordination with Istemi Yabgu. Across the eastern steppe, additional tribal groups were brought under control. Within a single campaigning season, a powerful state was transformed into a true empire. At the same time, pressure on Chinese territory continued. Raids crossed the frontier, draining resources and undermining confidence. Western Wei, unable to halt these attacks, through force alone, turned again to diplomacy. Envoys arrived bearing enormous quantities of silk. Their reception at the Göktürk court was carefully choreographed. Respect was shown, but dominance was never concealed. The success of these negotiations revealed just how much the Chinese court valued stability along its northern border. By this stage, the Göktürk state had become the decisive power of Inner Asia. Western Wei secured peace through tribute. Northern Qi doubled down on fortifications. Yet Mukhan's ambitions extended beyond China. His next objective lay to the southwest, in the lands of the Tuyuhun. With Chinese cooperation, Göktürk forces advanced rapidly through frontier regions and struck deep into Tuyuhun territory. Coordination between steppe cavalry and Chinese commanders produced swift results. Fortresses fell, leaders were captured, and immense wealth was seized. When the campaign ended, Mukhan distributed rewards generously, recognizing both loyalty and effectiveness. Following these victories, direct interaction with China temporarily declined. This pause did not reflect weakness, but confidence. With no rival capable of challenging him beyond the Chinese frontier, Mukhan had achieved strategic supremacy. Meanwhile, the Chinese states turned inward, fighting one another for control of the north. Diplomacy, however, never fully stopped. Envoys continued to travel between courts. Mukhan recognized new regimes when it suited his interests, exchanged gifts, and positioned the Göktürk state as an unavoidable power broker. The culmination of this strategy came through marriage politics. As rivalry between Chinese states intensified, each sought Göktürk support. Mukhan exploited this competition relentlessly. When one side increased its offer, he demanded more from the other. Marriage was never a matter of sentiment. It was leverage. Agreements were made, broken, restored, and broken again. Joint campaigns were planned, abandoned, and resumed. Raids into Chinese territory brought devastation without occupation. When alliances collapsed, Mukhan answered with force, withdrawing only after achieving economic damage and psychological impact. One major campaign ended disastrously for Chinese forces due to severe weather and poor coordination. The Göktürks also suffered from harsh conditions, but they returned with enormous booty. Entire regions were stripped of livestock and population. The message was unmistakable. This alliance reshaped Chinese politics. One state gained a decisive advantage over the other. Within a few years, northern Qi collapsed entirely. The balance of power in China shifted, not through Chinese armies alone, but through Göktürk intervention. At the height of his power, Mukhan ruled an empire stretching from Korea in the east to the Black Sea in the west. From the Great Wall to the northern wilderness, his authority was unchallenged. The Silk Road passed largely through Göktürk hands, ensuring wealth, influence, and stability across Eurasia. Trade flourished. Sogdian merchants operated under protection. Communication between East and West became safer than it had been for generations. When Mukan died in the early 500s and 70s, his death was marked by steppe rituals of mourning and blood. Even foreign envoys were expected to participate. His legacy was unmistakable. He had transformed the Göktürks into the greatest power of their age and altered the course of Chinese history itself. Before his death, Mukan ensured stability by naming his brother Taspar as successor. This decision avoided immediate conflict and allowed the empire to continue without disruption. Under Taspar, the Göktürk state remained powerful, but a subtle shift occurred. While Mukan had balanced the Chinese states against each other with cold precision, Taspar increasingly favoured the Eastern court. This choice would have consequences. More significantly, Taspar opened the Göktürk world to Buddhism, influenced by captured monks and foreign texts. Temples were built, scriptures were translated. For the first time, a steppe empire absorbed a major universal religion. By the early Sui years, we are looking at a China that still carried the bruises of division. For a long time, northern courts had been locked in bitter rivalry, Chu against Qi, fighting each other so fiercely that the whole frontier system weakened. While Chinese forces drained themselves in internal struggle, the Göktürks learned to play the situation with cold precision. They kept channels open to both sides, and because each dynasty feared the other might secure Turk support, both began to treat the steppe power as a force that could decide who felt safe and who felt exposed. From our perspective, the cost of that dependence was obvious. Wealth flowed outward instead of building defence at home. Gifts and payments became routine, not as a gesture of friendship, but as a desperate price for breathing room. And on the borderlands, ordinary people felt the consequences most sharply. Raids became a seasonal terror. Communities watched herds driven off, settlements stripped, and garrisons pressured. It was not simply military loss, but the steady humiliation of living under the shadow of someone else's initiative. So we framed the problem as more than a battlefield challenge. We presented it as a national turning point. We reminded our audience that this cycle of weakness did not happen overnight, and it was not caused by one defeat. It was the result of years of fragmentation, years in which Chinese states fought each other and unintentionally invited foreign pressure to grow. By the time the Göktürks were striking deep into frontier regions, the sense of anger and exhaustion had piled up like a storm ready to break. Then, we pivoted to a message of restoration. We argued that the moment had come to reverse the flow of power, to rebuild unity, and to stop treating survival as something bought with tribute. We positioned this new direction as inevitable, as if history itself had turned in our favour, and that the task ahead was not a personal ambition, but a larger necessity. The goal was simple: end the old pattern where the frontier decided our fate and replace it with a frontier we controlled. But we also explained how that change would actually be funded. We pointed out that the resources sent outward in gifts were not truly lost money, because once redirected, they could strengthen the state in a far more practical way. If we invested those same resources into recruitment, equipment, and border readiness, we could expand the army and hold the line with permanence instead of panic. The argument was designed to sound rational and reassuring. What used to be wasted could become the engine of security. And we made sure to tie strategy back to everyday life, because that is where legitimacy is won. If the border becomes stable, farmers can plough without fear, families can plan a harvest, and communities can rebuild routine instead of reacting to disaster. With stronger forces stationed where they are needed, the frontier stops being a wound that bleeds every summer and becomes a shield. In our narrative, victory is not only defeating a raid, but restoring normal life. In this period, we can almost hear the tone of confidence coming from the Chinese court. The leadership looks north and argues that the Steppe Empire is about to be hit by two disasters at once. They predict that the nomads will be forced to pull their armies back, scatter their forces, and settle into defensive positions. And once that happens, the plan is simple. Push deeper, strike from multiple directions, cut off escape routes, and seize a large part of their people while their strength drains away. But the strategy goes beyond battlefields. The court also insists that the Turks look united from the outside, yet inside they are fractured. Rival leaders quarrel, brothers turn on brothers, and suspicion spreads through the ruling family. Meanwhile, neighbouring groups to the east watch closely, nursing old grudges, waiting for the right moment to pounce. The message is clear. If we apply pressure at the right time, the steppe will be forced into conflicts that serve China's interests, because their enemies will rise against them the moment weakness shows. To justify a full-scale campaign, the court paints a picture of a land under stress. We hear of failed rains and harsh seasons, rivers shrinking, insect swarms devouring what remains, and grazing lands turning barren. In this telling, raids into the south become a matter of survival rather than ambition. The emperor goes further and frames these hardships as a kind of divine punishment, a sign that the Turks have lost heaven's favour. With that moral argument in place, the court calls for tighter logistics, hand-picked troops, and capable generals, and it demands one thing above all: the heads of the Turks' best commanders and fighters. The promise is tempting, vast territory from the eastern seas to the deserts in the west. But there is also a warning. The far north may be conquered, yet it is too bleak and wild to truly settle. Victory, the court argues, must be about controlling the useful lands, not chasing empty horizons. Then, the plan turns into action. In the spring of 583, China launches a major expedition. Armies split into separate columns and advance toward the frontier, aiming to catch the Turks off balance. When they meet the Turk forces, the outcome is shaped by a moment of bold decision-making. Chinese commanders argue that the Turks have grown careless after repeated successes and are not prepared for a sudden strike. An attack is launched, and it works. The Turks, caught unready, are beaten back so quickly that they abandon equipment and valuables as they retreat into the steppe. Yet the battlefield defeat is only the beginning. Famine follows, supplies collapse, and we see soldiers reduced to desperate measures. Then, disease spreads through the army, killing many and weakening the entire structure of power at the centre. As the crisis deepens, the real battlefield becomes politics. Chinese agents and diplomats begin to exploit rivalries among Turk leaders, encouraging distrust, feeding competition, and pushing ambitious figures to break away. One leader is told that another is secretly undermining him. Another is warned that an attack is coming and that only outside support can save him. Piece by piece, the unity of the steppe is pulled apart. Some factions send envoys to China, hoping for recognition or help against their own kin. But the Chinese court does not always want a final collapse. A shattered steppe can produce a new power even more dangerous than the old one. So the court chooses a colder strategy. Keep the internal conflict alive, support instability when it is useful, and refuse any request that might create a strong replacement. In the middle of these internal wars, raids and counter-raids continue. Even while fighting one another, Turk forces still manage to strike Chinese territory hard, proving that the steppe can lash out even when divided. But over time, pressure builds. More tribes drift away, manpower drops, and rival centers of power rise in different regions. Eventually, the leading Turk ruler is forced into a humiliating position. He begins to search for survival through diplomacy. Step by step, he ties himself to the Chinese emperor through the language of family, loyalty, and dependence, presenting himself not as a rival sovereign, but as a subordinate bound by obligation. Chinese envoys then press the advantage, demanding gestures of submission that shock the Turk elite and signal a major shift in status. From this point, the relationship changes in tone. We see ceremonial exchanges, gifts, and formal messages that underline the new hierarchy. Chinese officials treat the Turk ruler as a vassal, while the steppe leadership tries to preserve dignity under heavy pressure. At the same time, opposition at home grows stronger, and rival leaders gather followers and expand their influence. The steppe world is now split into competing camps, and China moves carefully, supporting one side when it benefits the border, restraining another side when it threatens to unite too quickly. When the main ruler becomes too weak to resist, he asks for direct help. China agrees, sends support, and with that assistance he strikes back, regains territory, and restores some authority. But the price is obvious. Dependence deepens, suspicion remains, and the court continues to treat him as someone to manage, not an equal to respect. By the late 580s, the story reaches a final turn. After years of unrest, the steppe ruler falls ill and dies. The Chinese court publicly mourns, but the political reality is unchanged. The steppe has been drawn into China's sphere, and leadership transitions now take place under the shadow of Chinese influence. A new ruler takes power and quickly signals obedience, while China pushes for the removal of remaining internal rivals. Even the fate of captured challengers becomes a matter debated in the Chinese court, because the goal is no longer just victory in battle. It is long-term control through division, leverage, and carefully timed restraint. In the end, we are left with a clear picture of how an empire can weaken another, not only with armies, but by turning its internal fractures into an instrument of policy. In 588, Baga Khagan set out on a western campaign against a neighbouring land, whose name our sources do not clearly preserve. During this expedition, a battle turned suddenly against him. He was struck in the forehead by an arrow and died on the field. From the way events were unfolding, we might expect that after eliminating the threat of Apo, Baga would try to defeat Tardu next and restore unity across the Turkic realm. That is why we consider one possibility. The unnamed opponent in this campaign may have been connected to the Western Turkic power sphere. Still, we have to stay cautious because the surviving record does not give enough detail to confirm exactly who this enemy was. The sources also describe Baga's appearance as unusually different from other Turkic rulers. They portray him with prominent cheekbones, a hunched back, and a pale complexion, while also emphasizing his courage and sharp judgment. Whatever the accuracy of these physical details, the narrative is consistent in presenting him as both brave and intelligent. After Baga's unexpected death, the leadership moved quickly to avoid a vacuum. They elevated Yung Yulu, the son of Ishbara, who had been serving as Yabku, and proclaimed him khagan. Once on the throne, he maintained a careful relationship with the Sui court. Envoys were exchanged, gifts flowed, and year after year the Eastern Turkic leadership sent offerings to China. For the first time since the rise of the Göktürk state, this relationship took on the form of regular annual tribute. It was a striking reversal in historical memory. The same steppe power that had once pressed China hard now operated under the shadow of Chinese political superiority. Meanwhile, a major shift took place inside China itself. In 589, after centuries of division, the Sui dynasty completed the political reunification of the Chinese realm by destroying the last southern rival regime. This mattered enormously for the steppe, because it meant the Göktürks were no longer dealing with competing Chinese states. They now faced a single, consolidated empire with stronger resources, clearer strategy, and a more stable frontier policy. Even so, the Sui emperor avoided relying on Turkic forces in the southern conquest. He argued that steppe armies did not know the terrain of China's southern mountains and river valleys. But we can also sense another fear beneath the official explanation. Letting nomadic cavalry roam deep in the south risked uncontrolled plunder and new instability. So the Sui state won its unification without handing the Göktürks an opening. For a few years after that, the eastern Göktürk state appears strangely quiet. Our information is thin, but the silence itself suggests a period of restraint. We see occasional embassies and ceremonial gifts, yet no major initiatives against China. Then the situation changes again. Not because of open war at first, but because politics begins to ferment inside the Turkic court. Opponents of the Sui dynasty started to flee north and gather around the Turkic camp, especially around a powerful princess who carried old loyalties and old resentments. Networks formed in the background, and an anti-Sui coalition began to take shape on steppe soil. As this faction grew bolder, the eastern khagan eventually shifted course. Tribute was interrupted, and raids on Chinese borderlands resumed. The relationship that had looked stable suddenly became hostile again. The Sui response was not only military. Once more, the court relied on its most effective weapon: influence operations inside the steppe leadership. An experienced agent was sent north to observe, report, and fracture alliances. At first, he was treated coldly, even insulted, because the anti-Sui faction believed it could now dominate policy. But the agent adapted. Instead of confronting the leadership directly, he found leverage through the council and through bribery. A carefully timed exposure followed, revealing secret plotting inside the khagan's own circle. The result was humiliation at the top and panic among the conspirators. Arrests followed, and the khagan tried to regain credibility by punishing those closest to the plot. At the same time, new dangers appeared within the steppe itself. Rival princes and commanders gained strength and became threats to the ruler's position. Internal violence escalated, including the killing of a powerful brother who had become too dangerous to tolerate. Alongside these purges, we also see another major development. Turkic tribal elites outside the ruling Ashina line began to open direct relations with China. They sent animals as gifts, asked for border markets, and sought regular trade. The Sui emperor accepted these proposals, and with that, a long-term shift became possible. China could now build influence not only through the khagan, but through alternative tribal power centers, using commerce and recognition to weaken the monopoly of the ruling house. Then, a new figure emerged in the north, a leader known by the title Tuyu Li, connected to Barga's line, ruling far from the central steppe around the Baikal region. He sent envoys to China and signaled that he wanted formal ties, even an imperial marriage alliance. The Sui court recognized the strategic value immediately. It could elevate this northern leader, pull him closer and use him as a counterweight to the main khagan. In other words, the old method returned: divide the steppe and manage its rival centers. The pressure campaign worked. Conditions were attached, accusations flew, and steppe politics turned deadly. The princess who had served as the symbol and organizer of anti-Sui resistance was ultimately killed, and the khagan then attempted to repair relations by requesting a new marriage alliance with the Sui court. But inside the Chinese leadership, the debate was sharp. Some argued that granting the khagan a marriage tie would only strengthen him, forcing other steppe rivals to submit and creating a larger threat to China later. They preferred backing Tu Li instead, because he could be drawn south, controlled, and used as a shield against future raids. From this point, the story accelerates toward open war. The khagan sought to recreate a unified, great Göktürk Empire, but Tardu in the west stood in his way. Their rivalry led to repeated clashes. Meanwhile, China played both sides, keeping formal relations alive while quietly building alternative alliances. When the khagan finally prepared a major strike against China, Tu Li warned the Sui court in advance. Border garrisons fortified, Chinese commanders positioned their forces, and the raids failed to achieve decisive results. The next year brought a larger crisis. The eastern khagan and Tardu joined forces, not to attack China first, but to crush Tu Li as a traitor and punish the collaboration that had undermined steppe unity. Tu Li was caught, defeated, and nearly destroyed. His close relatives were killed, his tribal base scattered, and he fled with only a few riders into the night. In the chaos, his Chinese advisor saved him with a calculated deception, steering him into a fortress by using signal fires to create the illusion of a massive encirclement. Once safely inside, they raced south to the Sui capital and placed themselves under imperial protection. China responded quickly. Titles and rewards were granted, and Tu Li was turned into a protected client leader. The Sui emperor then attempted to force a settlement by pushing for a negotiated arrangement between rival Turkic factions. At the same time, Chinese frontier forces began probing north, fighting steppe units, taking prisoners, and seizing large herds. Yet even here we see the limits of imperial power. Chinese armies often advanced, won skirmishes, and then hesitated to push too far beyond the frontier line, wary of overextension in steppe terrain. Under the command of Yang Su, a large Chinese army moved north to confront Tardu. Although this campaign formally involved an alliance between Toulon and Tardu, it was clear from the start that Tardu was the dominant figure on the steppe side. When Yang Su managed to halt Tardu's early raids, the Chinese court rewarded him generously, signalling how seriously this threat was taken. Chinese commanders quickly realized that the Göktürk cavalry relied on sudden advances followed by rapid withdrawals. To counter this, they experimented with combined formations, placing cavalry between lines of war wagons arranged in long, branching shapes. Yet Yang Su was not satisfied. He argued that this was not a war that could be won on foot or with rigid formations. If victory was possible, it would only come through speed and mounted force. In the end, the entire Chinese army was reorganized as cavalry. When Tardu heard that the Chinese were abandoning traditional formations and preparing for mounted warfare, he was delighted. According to later accounts, he dismounted, bowed toward the sky, and declared that this was a gift from heaven. He rode out to meet them with more than 100,000 light cavalry. Chinese officers observing the Göktürk camp noticed that Tardu's army was not yet fully prepared. They urged an immediate attack. Yang Su accepted the proposal, and Chinese cavalry surged forward without delay. The assault caught Tardu completely off guard. His forces collapsed under the sudden pressure, suffering heavy losses. Tardu himself was badly wounded, but managed to escape the battlefield. The number of dead was so great that later, chroniclers avoided giving figures. What remained of the Göktürk army withdrew in deep shock. Not long after, another Chinese commander attempted a surprise strike against Toulon by advancing north of the Gobi. Political opposition at court, however, forced him to abandon the operation and return. Even so, the damage had been done. With Tardu wounded and Toulon weakened, the balance of power shifted. At this moment, Tuli, who had taken refuge in China, rose to prominence. With no other strong rival left in the east, the Chinese court openly recognized him as khagan. From this point onward, he appears in the sources under a new title that emphasized loyalty and reliability. His authority was no longer based on steppe consensus, but on Chinese backing. As chaos spread across the Göktürk world, many tribes abandoned their former leaders and placed themselves under Tuli's protection. Their numbers grew rapidly, soon reaching into the tens of thousands. Chinese officials carefully settled these groups in fortified zones, presenting the move as protection but clearly intending supervision. Despite this control, the newcomers appeared relieved. After years of war, survival itself felt like victory. Meanwhile, rebellion erupted among tribes still loyal to Toulon. Fighting intensified and bloodshed spread across the steppe. Chinese envoys offered surrender terms, but Toulon rejected them outright. Even as his position deteriorated, he refused compromise. Tuli, grateful for Chinese support, made his loyalty highly visible. At a court archery event, he even asked to be placed in the same group as the Chinese agent overseeing him, signaling trust and submission. Yet his growing following alarmed the court. The emperor ordered the construction of a fortified settlement and relocated Tuli and his people there, keeping them within reach of imperial power. As these measures unfolded, the Chinese launched renewed operations against both Toulon and Tardu. Battles along the northern frontier produced mixed results. Some Chinese forces were defeated badly. Others scored limited victories. In one engagement, a Chinese commander narrowly escaped annihilation after half his army was killed. Years later, the emperor would order a Buddhist shrine built on the site after seeing the remains of the dead. Before Chinese commanders could strike again, Toulon was killed by his own followers. With his death, Tardu claimed a supreme authority, declaring himself the sole khagan of the Göktürk world. This move, however, did not restore order. Instead, instability deepened. Chinese strategists argued that the moment had come to send Tuli back north. They believed that the fragmented tribes would rally to him and that his presence would further weaken Tardu. With imperial approval, Tuli returned to steppe territory. Many tribes indeed submitted, but not all. The frontier remained volatile. Tardu responded by launching renewed raids. Chinese forces massed along key garrisons, and a decisive shift followed when a Chinese commander proposed an unconventional tactic. Instead of confronting the Göktürk army directly, water sources were poisoned. The effect was devastating. Soldiers and animals died in large numbers. Unaware of the cause, Göktürk survivors believed the sky itself had turned against them and fled in panic. Chinese forces pursued them, killing thousands more. Although Chinese commanders claimed success, rivalry at court led some officials to downplay these victories. They argued that the Göktürks would eventually submit on their own. Events soon proved otherwise. Tardu struck again, inflicting a serious defeat on a Chinese force. Once more, a shrine would later mark the place where the fallen lay. Despite these setbacks, Tardu remained the dominant power until widespread rebellion erupted among the Turks tribes. One group after another rose against him. Even Western allies collapsed under pressure. Eventually, Tardu fled south, seeking refuge among neighbouring peoples. After this, the record falls silent. By the end of 603, his political career was effectively over. With Tardu gone, the Chinese-backed Tuli took the throne of the eastern Göktürk state. He did not settle at the traditional sacred center of power, but remained close to the Chinese frontier, ensuring rapid access to protection if rebellion broke out. Many tribes submitted, but unity was incomplete. Raids continued, and Chinese commanders were still defeated along the border. At the same time, new revolts erupted inside China itself. Some rebels sought Göktürk support. Others were intercepted before they could escape. The frontier became a zone of constant movement, betrayal, and shifting loyalties. One of the most revealing moments came when Tuli openly expressed his desire to adopt Chinese customs entirely. He admired the climate, comfort, and lifestyle of the South. He asked to live and dress like a Chinese noble. The emperor refused. From his perspective, a fully assimilated khagan would mean the final dissolution of steppe independence, but also the loss of a useful buffer. Despite the refusal, the emperor staged massive ceremonies to display Tuli's special status. Enormous tents were erected, feasts held, and gifts distributed in quantities unmatched for any other foreign ruler. Millions of bolts of silk were presented. Tuli was seated above other princes and foreign leaders, signaling that through him, China now claimed influence over the entire northern world. Yet this closeness also alarmed Chinese officials. Some warned that the Göktürks were learning China's terrain too well and could one day turn this knowledge against the empire. After these displays, the emperor advanced into Göktürk territory. Tuli prepared the route personally, organizing the tribes to clear and secure a vast road across the steppe. When the emperor arrived, Tuli demonstrated ritual submission, offering drink while kneeling. Deeply satisfied, the emperor rewarded him again and returned south. Still, Tuli's wish to become fully Chinese did not fade. He returned repeatedly, received palaces, furnishings, and honors, yet never achieved formal assimilation. Even so, he remained loyal, refusing alliances that would threaten China, including overtures from Korea. In 609, Tuli died. The Chinese court declared mourning. His son succeeded him, taking the title Shibi Khagan. Unlike his father, Shibi did not seek accommodation. Under his leadership, the eastern Göktürk state rapidly regained strength. Soon after, Chinese rebellions multiplied. Rebel leaders contacted Shibi directly. He supported them openly, granting titles and banners. His armies crossed the frontier repeatedly. In 615, he launched a massive campaign and trapped the Chinese emperor inside a fortress. Supplies ran low. Panic spread. Only the intervention of Shibi's Chinese-born consort prevented disaster, persuading him to withdraw. The damage was already done. The siege shattered imperial authority. Rebellions exploded across China. Governors and princes rose in arms. The empire began to collapse. As the Sui dynasty began to collapse, rebellion spread across China. One rebel leader after another looked north for support, and many of them turned to the Göktürks. Liu Wuchu was among those who openly submitted to Shibi Khagan and secured Göktürk backing. With Turkic cavalry at his side, he defeated and killed rival commanders, forced others to flee, and seized key cities. Palaces were looted and captured members of the imperial household were handed over to the Göktürks. In return, Shibi rewarded Liu Wuchu with horses, titles, and symbols of authority, openly recognizing him as a regional ruler under Turkic protection. At the same time, the founder of the Tang dynasty, Li Yuan, faced a far more dangerous situation. He lacked the military strength of his rivals and understood that without outside support, his uprising might fail. Acting on the advice of his closest aides, he made a calculated decision. We see him reaching out to the Göktürks with gifts, promises, and carefully chosen words. He asked for limited assistance, stressed discipline over plunder, and offered enormous rewards in gold and silk if an alliance could be secured. Shibi Khagan agreed. From his perspective, the Sui dynasty was already finished, and backing Li Yuan served Göktürk interests. Envoys moved quickly between the steppe and China. Within days, confirmation arrived that Göktürk support was on the way. For Li Yuan and his followers, this was a turning point. They feared Göktürk raids, yet they also understood that Turkic horses alone could decide the outcome. In the end, Li Yuan accepted the risk. He chose survival over caution. Göktürk troops soon appeared with horses and supplies. Li Yuan treated them with extraordinary honor, staging ceremonies that made clear their importance. He carefully prevented his own men from cheating the Göktürks, warning that betrayal would bring devastating retaliation. The alliance held, more requests followed, and more Turkic aid arrived, though always in limited numbers, reflecting Li Yuan's concern that too many foreign troops would frighten the population. Meanwhile, other Chinese rebels also sought Göktürk favor. Some were accepted, others manipulated, and some were deliberately set against each other. The Göktürks encouraged rivalry, rewarding obedience while allowing enemies to destroy one another. Through this strategy, Shibi Khagan expanded his influence without committing to a single Chinese faction. By 618, the Tang dynasty had been formally established, yet instability remained. Even after the empire's founding, Chinese officials continued to defect to the Göktürks, receiving Turkic titles in exchange for loyalty. Shibi Khagan now commanded not only steppe warriors, but also vast numbers of allied tribes and defectors. His power reached unprecedented levels, and relations with the Tang court took on a striking imbalance. Göktürk envoys were received with lavish ceremonies, music, and banquets, while Chinese emperors tolerated open arrogance from steppe representatives. Shibi Khagan's death during preparations for a major campaign changed the balance again. Leadership passed to his successors, and once more the Göktürks supported Tang opponents. They promoted alternative claimants, installed puppet rulers, and encouraged renewed resistance against the dynasty they had helped create. When Chuluo Khagan took power, this policy continued. He backed former Sui princes, ordered northern Chinese leaders to submit, and supported the rebuilding of rival administrations. Yet the steppe itself was unstable. Rebels defected, alliances shifted, and Chinese agents worked tirelessly to undermine Göktürk plans. Eventually, Chuluo Khagan was poisoned through covert action, preventing a massive coordinated invasion before it could even begin. After his death, power passed to Ilig Khagan, who presided over the strongest phase of Eastern Göktürk dominance. Under his rule, raids became constant and far-reaching. We see Göktürk armies crossing the frontier repeatedly, overwhelming garrisons, defeating Chinese commanders, and penetrating deep into Tang territory. Entire regions were devastated. Cities fell, supplies vanished, and panic spread as far as the imperial court. At times, the situation became so severe that Tang officials advised abandoning the capital altogether. Only firm resistance from key figures prevented this. Even so, the pressure did not ease. Göktürk leaders demanded marriages, tribute, and submission, while continuing to raid regardless of promises made. Eventually, the conflict reached a breaking point. Massive Turkic armies once again pushed deep into China, but this time Chinese forces were stronger, better coordinated, and more determined. Diplomacy and deception played decisive roles. At a critical moment, negotiations were forced, and a treaty was concluded under dramatic circumstances. The Tang emperor swore oaths, sacrifices were made, and peace was proclaimed. On the surface, the agreement appeared equal. In reality, both sides were buying time. The Göktürks had reached the limits of what plunder could achieve, while China had learned how vulnerable the Steppe Confederation truly was. Ilig Khagan withdrew, laden with gifts, confident in his strength. Yet his army was scattered, his allies divided, and his leaders distracted by wealth. After the agreement reached on the banks of the Wei River, the political and military dominance of the eastern Göktürk state over the Tang dynasty came to an end. From this moment on, the balance shifted rapidly. While the Tang Empire steadily grew stronger, the Göktürks entered a phase of internal weakness that they could not reverse. As Emperor Taizong consolidated his authority, Chinese officials who opposed the Tang regime began defecting one by one. Many of them openly declared that the Göktürk Khagan was ruling poorly and that the state was nearing collapse. Even when the Khagan attempted to pursue these defectors, he failed to stop them from escaping. Ironically, the same ruler who had repeatedly crushed Chinese armies and led deep raids into Chinese territory since the early 620s could not maintain stability within his own realm. One of his greatest mistakes was placing excessive trust in foreign advisors and abandoning long-standing Göktürk traditions. The legal system, once simple and closely tied to steppe life, was altered under outside influence. Customs were disrupted, authority weakened, and public trust eroded. At the same time, the Khagan distanced himself from his own people and drew closer to Sogdian elites. These advisors encouraged unnecessary campaigns and drained the state's resources. Discontent spread quickly across the tribes. Then, nature delivered a devastating blow. Several harsh winters struck in succession. Snow fell so heavily that livestock died in massive numbers. With animals lost and food supplies depleted, famine set in. In response, the Khagan imposed heavy taxes, hoping to stabilize the economy. Instead, this pushed the population further toward rebellion. By 627, large tribal groups began to rise against the central authority. Some Western tribes, weakened after the decline of their own leaders, initially submitted to the eastern Göktürks. But poor governance soon drove them into open revolt. Uyghurs, Bayerku, and Sir Tardush tribes launched coordinated uprisings, plunging the state into civil war. The Khagan responded by sending massive cavalry forces under royal princes to crush the rebels. These campaigns failed disastrously. Entire armies were ambushed, defeated, and scattered. Thousands of soldiers were captured or defected to the rebels, strengthening the opposition even further. Within a year, the Khagan had lost control over most of his commanders. What had once been the strongest power on the steppe now descended into chaos. Another brutal winter followed. Snow covered even the lowlands, livestock perished almost entirely, and starvation became widespread. Chinese envoys observing the situation reported bluntly that a state whose strength depended on horses and sheep could not survive such conditions. In their assessment, collapse was inevitable within a few years. Despite these signs, Emperor Taizong initially refused to launch an attack, believing the Göktürks would fall on their own. However, rebellions continued to spread. Even Mongolic tribes joined the uprisings. When the Khagan punished his own relatives for military failure, he shattered the last remaining loyalty within the ruling family. One key figure, Tuli Khagan, broke with the ruler entirely and turned to China for support. Taizong accepted him openly, marking a decisive turning point. From this moment on, the Tang court actively supported Göktürk defectors. Meanwhile, former Chinese rebels who had relied on Göktürk backing were defeated as aid from the steppe dried up. Without horses, food, or coordination, Göktürk forces could no longer operate effectively inside China. Still, the khagan attempted renewed raids along the frontier. Taizong dismissed these attacks as desperate gestures, convinced the Göktürk state was no longer viable. At the same time, a new power emerged among the western tribes. The Sertadush leader Inan was proclaimed khagan and established his authority in Otuken. One tribe after another joined him. His state quickly gained recognition, even from China, signaling the complete fragmentation of Göktürk unity. By late 629, the collapse accelerated. Entire Göktürk contingents crossed into China and surrendered. Tribal leaders pledged loyalty to the Tang Emperor. Raids were repelled with ease. The Tang court openly celebrated what it saw as a historic reversal. The former masters of the north were now submitting voluntarily. Early in 630, Chinese generals launched a coordinated campaign against the remaining forces loyal to the old khagan. Through rapid night marches and surprise attacks, key Göktürk centers were captured. The khagan fled repeatedly, abandoning his camp, family, and followers. Even as he attempted to negotiate surrender, Chinese commanders pressed forward. Under cover of fog, elite cavalry units struck his encampment. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. The khagan escaped briefly but was soon betrayed and handed over. He was taken to Chang'an, where Emperor Taizong confronted him personally. Although spared execution due to earlier agreements, the former ruler lived out his final years in humiliation. He died shortly afterward, stripped of power and influence. With his capture, the eastern Göktürk state ceased to exist. In the aftermath, tens of thousands of Göktürks fled in different directions. Some joined the western steppe powers, others migrated deep into Central Asia. More than 100,000 sought refuge inside China. After intense debate, the Tang court chose to resettle them across a wide frontier zone under strict military supervision. China had not only defeated a rival empire, it had absorbed its population, dismantled its leadership, and reorganized the steppe according to imperial interests. After their original homeland was destroyed in a violent collapse, only fragments of the Ashina clan survived. A small group of families fled north and found refuge among steppe powers, eventually settling in the Altai Mountains. Here, in a harsh but resource-rich land, they lived as metalworkers, forging iron and weapons. The shape of the Altai range reminded them of a helmet, and in their language the word for helmet became their name. This was how the people later known as the Göktürks came to be called so. But memory alone did not define them. Myth did as well. According to their own traditions, the Ashina lineage descended from a lone surviving child, rescued by a she-wolf after his people were annihilated. Raised in isolation, protected and nourished, this child became the ancestor of a new people. From the union of human and wolf, the Göktürks believed their line was born. This belief was not symbolic alone. It shaped their identity. The wolf became their guide, their emblem, and the mark of their origins. As generations passed, the Ashina multiplied. When they finally emerged from their hidden valleys, they did so as a unified group and entered the orbit of larger steppe confederations. Over time, their leaders gained strength, authority, and followers. One figure in particular rose above the rest. Two men, a leader of the Ashina house, transformed the Göktürks from vassals into masters. When he challenged the dominant steppe power of his time and destroyed it in battle, he proclaimed himself Khagan. With this declaration, the Göktürk state was born. From this moment on, we see a political structure emerge that was both flexible and hierarchical. Power rested with the ruling Ashina family, but authority was distributed among brothers, sons, and trusted commanders. Titles such as Khagan, Yabgu, Shad, and Tigin defined rank, duty, and proximity to the ruling house. Leadership was not only inherited, but proven through loyalty, skill, and success in war. The Göktürk world was vast. Under powerful rulers like Mukan Khagan, their influence stretched from the eastern forests to the western deserts, from the northern lakes to the southern trade routes. Tribes across Inner Asia submitted, paid tribute, or entered alliances. Some feared them, others sought their protection. Yet this empire was not built on cities or walls. It was built on movement. The Göktürks lived with their herds, following the rhythm of the seasons. Horses were central to their lives, not only as tools of war, but as symbols of wealth and survival. Their taxes were paid in soldiers, animals, and service. Every man was a warrior when needed. Every family was part of the state. Their banners carried the image of a golden wolf's head, a reminder that they had not forgotten where they came from. Their elite guards were called the Wolves. Their leaders believed strength came from remembering the past as much as conquering the present. Law among the Göktürks was strict and uncompromising. Murder, betrayal, and rebellion were punished by death. Theft demanded restitution many times over. Social order was preserved through harsh justice, but also through custom and honor. Family ties mattered deeply. Loyalty to kin and ruler defined one's place in society. Their rituals reflected a world where the living, the dead, and the spirits were closely connected. When a leader died, mourning was fierce and public. Blood and tears flowed together as mourners cut their faces in grief. Horses and sheep were sacrificed. The dead were honored not immediately, but at the proper season when nature itself allowed burial. They believed the land, the sky, and unseen forces shaped destiny. Each year, leaders gathered at sacred places to offer sacrifices to the sky and to the spirits of the earth. These ceremonies reaffirmed unity, legitimacy, and continuity. Despite their power, the Göktürks were never static. Rivalries within the ruling family led to division. The great empire eventually split into eastern and western realms. Each followed its own path, forged alliances and fought wars, sometimes even against one another. In the west, new rulers emerged, who controlled trade routes and distant territories. In the east, khagans faced pressure from China, from internal revolts, and from changing climates. Harsh winters brought famine. Heavy taxation bred resentment. Tribes rebelled. Loyalty fractured. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual unraveling. Power slipped away through internal conflict, strategic manipulation by neighbors, and the relentless weight of environmental hardship. Some Göktürks surrendered. Others migrated. Some became soldiers in foreign armies. Others vanished into the vastness of the steppe. When a new ruler was chosen among the Göktürks, the ceremony that followed was both symbolic and severe. The leading nobles and senior officials placed the chosen man on a felt carpet and turned him 9 times in the direction of the sun. With each rotation, the ministers bowed deeply, offering formal salutations. Once the ritual was complete, the ruler was mounted on a horse, and a silk cloth was tied loosely around his neck. At that moment, he was expected to speak honestly, without hesitation or resistance. He was then asked a single question: how many years he believed he could rule. Rarely could a ruler give a precise answer. His words were interpreted by the nobles, adjusted if necessary, and accepted as a sign of fate rather than a promise. Leadership among the Göktürks was not seen as absolute power, but as a responsibility measured by destiny and strength. Daily life among the Göktürks reflected the harsh rhythm of the steppe. Men and women gathered in open woodland or near reed-filled plains to celebrate with games, music, and drink. Leather balls filled with hair were kicked across the ground in communal contests. Fermented mare's milk flowed freely, and as people drank, they sang loudly, shouted, and entered states of ritual intoxication. Spirits, ancestral forces, and the sky deity were honored together. Shamans and diviners held respected positions. Titles and ranks formed a complex hierarchy. The supreme ruler bore the title of khagan. His wife held a distinct royal title, while sons and brothers were known as princes. Military governors controlled subject tribes, and elite commanders carried honorific titles that reflected strength, lineage, or personal qualities. These titles were not symbolic alone. They determined authority, inheritance, and command. Names and ranks were often inspired by physical traits, age, hairstyle, clothing, eating habits, or even resemblance to animals. A strong and fearless man might receive a title associated with bravery or power. Others were named after colours, body features, or ritual roles. These titles were not distributed freely. Only members of the ruling family could hold the highest ranks, reinforcing the belief that authority flowed through bloodlines. Power among the Göktürks was rarely uncontested. Succession disputes were common, especially when questions arose over legitimacy or maternal lineage. Brothers challenged brothers, nephews challenged uncles, and alliances shifted constantly. Councils were held where nobles weighed strength, loyalty, and fear as much as tradition. Often, the strongest figure prevailed, even if custom favoured another. The Göktürk realm eventually divided into eastern and western branches, each ruled by related dynasties but driven by rivalry. While they shared common ancestry and culture, their political interests diverged. Both sides maintained relations with neighbouring powers, especially China, through diplomacy, warfare, tribute, and marriage alliances. Relations with Chinese dynasties followed a repeating pattern. At times, Göktürk rulers acknowledged Chinese authority in exchange for gifts, titles, or support against rivals. At other times, they raided border regions, forcing emperors to negotiate under pressure. Envoys travelled back and forth constantly, carrying horses, livestock, silk, precious goods, and political messages. Chinese courts carefully balanced appeasement and resistance. When the Göktürks were strong, diplomacy and marriage alliances were favoured. When internal divisions weakened them, military campaigns followed. Steppe politics were watched closely, and rival claimants were often supported to keep Göktürk power fragmented. Despite defeats, famines, and internal conflict, the Göktürks remained a dominant force for generations. Even when droughts dried rivers, livestock died, and disease spread through the camps, their leaders continued to fight for control. Hunger forced people to survive on anything available, yet resistance did not disappear overnight. A canal was cut between the provinces of Isia and Shachian, running east to west for several hundred lulli. The land along this channel was reserved for the herds of Chimin, turning a contested zone into controlled pasture. At the same time, the Sui court began deploying its commanders. Yang Su moved toward Liang province, Shi Huan Sui advanced into Yen province, and General Yao Pan headed toward the whole region. These forces were meant to converge on Tulan, but events unfolded too quickly. Before any coordinated campaign could begin, Tulan's own followers killed the commanders sent against him. Power collapsed into confusion, and Tardu stepped forward, proclaiming himself Khagan at Puchia. His claim did not bring order. Instead, widespread unrest broke out across his territory. In response, Shi Wan Sui was dispatched again, this time towards Shu province, to confront Tardu directly. The two sides met at Tarchin Shan, yet no formal battle followed. Tardu withdrew, choosing flight over open combat. His retreat turned into a rout as pursuing forces closed in, killing more than 1,000 men. Not long afterward, the frontier flared up once more. Around the year 600, Göktürk forces crossed the borders in renewed raids. Qin Wang, leading a campaign army, met them in battle and forced them back. The situation remained unstable, however. Early in the Zhen Shu era, around 601, the Göktürks seized Heng'an. Han Kung was sent to strike back and initially succeeded, but he was later defeated, and the losses were heavy, with large numbers of people killed or carried off. These episodes revealed a clear pattern along the northern frontier. Sudden raids, rapid counterattacks, and abrupt reversals that exposed how fragile authority remained. Yang Su was appointed garrison commander of Yun province and ordered to lead Chai Min northward. Several smaller groups, including Hu Si and other minor tribes, had attached themselves to Qi Min, only to rebel later. While Su's army was positioned north of the river, a Göktürk leader, Wu Su Li Erkin, crossed south and struck Qi Min's camp. The scale of the raid was immense. More than 200,000 sheep were driven away, and 6,000 people were taken captive before the raiders withdrew toward the steppe. The response was swift. Yang Su and the senior general Liang Mo pursued with light cavalry, forcing repeated engagements over long distances. After a series of clashes and a decisive final battle, the Erkin was defeated. Captives and recovered herds were returned to Chai Min, restoring both his resources and his standing. Further pressure followed as additional commanders were sent along separate routes to intercept fleeing groups. Many were captured or killed, and the army withdrew. Even then, calm did not last. Once the troops crossed back over the river, raiders returned again to plunder Choi Min's people, underscoring how persistent and cyclical frontier violence had become. Tactics shifted accordingly. Fan Kui, holding high command, was sent with forces to meet the enemy at Kuuchiaku, striking across the terrain from east to west. The Göktürks were again driven off, followed for more than 80 li. These operations reflected an effort to counter steppe mobility, with speed of equal force, using constant pressure to prevent rivals from regrouping or attracting new followers. As military clashes continued, the Sui court increasingly debated long-term policy. At the beginning of the Taye era, around 605, discussions focused on whether to accept the Göktürks inside the frontier, bind them with gifts, and reinforce ties through marriage, or to keep them firmly beyond the Great Wall. One senior official warned that nearby outsiders were never harmless. If allowed to settle, gain strength, and draw resources from the land, they could revive old ambitions and invite others to join them. From this perspective, defense was urgent, and pushing them outward was seen as the only lasting solution. Imperial strategy soon widened beyond the steppe. When Emperor Yang inspected the region north of the Great Wall in 607, he also visited Qi Min's camp, signaling close imperial oversight. At the same time, advisors urged action against Kaoli, arguing that its lands had once been administered by earlier Chinese dynasties. The proposal was direct: demand submission, and if refused, apply force with Göktürk support. The plan moved forward, but Kaoli resisted, and preparations for war intensified. Another political maneuver soon followed. When Chu Lo failed to appear before the emperor as ordered, attention shifted to She Kui, a rival of Khagan lineage. Court advisors believed that honouring She Kui and encouraging him to act would split Göktürk power. Promises of recognition and alliance were made. Şikai moved quickly, launching a surprise attack that crushed Chulo's forces. Chulo fled east with only a small body of cavalry, abandoning even his family in the chaos. As he moved from refuge to refuge, local rulers reported his whereabouts, and imperial agents sought to draw him in with promises of wealth and security. Eventually, he appeared at court no longer as an equal partner, but as a weakened figure under pressure. The tension reached its peak in 615. In the 8th month, Emperor Yang and the princes were surrounded at Yenmen by Göktürk forces. A senior official proposed a desperate solution: appeal to the influence of a princess married into the Göktürk elite, since women of rank among the northern peoples could shape military decisions. A message was sent, and the siege was lifted. Official explanations spoke of unrest elsewhere, forcing the Göktürks to withdraw, but the episode revealed how diplomacy, marriage ties, and internal steppe politics could succeed where armies alone might fail. The situation did not ease with the fall of the Sui. Into the early Tang period, Göktürk raids continued. Provinces were threatened, and emergency defences were raised whenever new incursions were reported. Large mounted forces crossed into multiple regions, cities were besieged, and local officials sometimes fled with their populations rather than risk open battle. At the same time, there were decisive responses. Counterattacks that broke raiding armies, captured prominent leaders, and used a mix of force and negotiation to prevent temporary victories from turning into lasting occupation. In the early 7th century, the Northern Wei court began to open a direct channel to the rising power beyond its northern frontier. A court official named Tai chose an envoy for this first contact, a Sogdian from the Juquan region, An no Panto. He was sent north to the Göktürks to begin a formal relationship, one that could be described as a cautious test of friendship across the steppe border. At that time, the Göktürks were still spoken of as a relatively small force on the western side of the frontier world. Their ruling clan was known as the Ashina. They lived along the northern slopes of the Altai range and, in earlier years, had worked as skilled smiths for the Ruran Khans, who dominated Inner Asia before them. As their leader Tumen grew stronger, raids against Wei's western border districts became more frequent, a steady pressure that forced the court to pay attention. When the envoy arrived, the Göktürk camp received him with open satisfaction. The mood was confident and expectant, as if the presence of a great empire's representative itself was a sign that the steppe state was about to rise quickly. Not long after, the balance of power in Inner Asia snapped into a new shape. In the first month of 552, Tumen launched a sudden attack against the Ruran and shattered them. Their ruler chose death rather than capture, and the surviving leadership scattered. Some fled toward the Chinese states to seek refuge, while those left behind attempted to rebuild around a new figure. The victory elevated Tumen into a new political world. He took the title of Il-Khagan, declaring a status that placed him among the supreme rulers of the steppe. The Göktürk elite order became clearer in the sources at this point. The queen carried the rank of Khatun. The sons and brothers of the ruling house were treated as princes, and military governors were appointed under titles tied to command and region. In 553, the first khagan died, and the throne passed to his son, known to the Chinese as Ko Lo, remembered in later tradition as Kara. After taking the khagan title, he sent an embassy back to Wei and offered an enormous gift of horses, a signal meant to turn a battlefield success into recognized legitimacy. The steppe struggle did not end with the fall of the Ruran. A remaining branch attempted to raise a rival khagan, only to be crushed in the north near the Woye region. The Göktürk leadership changed hands again. Qiu Lo died, his brother Su Qin came to power, and he is remembered under the name Mukan Khagan. Contemporary descriptions present him as a striking figure, not only physically unusual in appearance, but also extraordinarily bold in personality. He was portrayed as intelligent, calculating, and highly skilled in command. Under him, fear became a form of diplomacy. Neighbouring states adjusted their behaviour simply because they believed he could reach them. Campaigns followed in rapid sequence. The Rouran were struck again and finally abandoned their homeland, seeking refuge in Chinese territory. A Chinese ruler accepted them, reorganized their leadership, and attempted to settle them in a controlled way, using food and silk to keep them dependent. The Göktürks, pressed in one direction, offered peace in another. A rhythm emerged, raids and counter-marches, then negotiations, then renewed violence. In the mid-500s, Mukan attacked remaining Rouran elements, who still tried to survive as an independent group, then turned against the Hephthalites, moved east against steppe rivals, and drew distant peoples into his orbit. His realm was described as stretching from the eastern seas of the northeast to far western lakes, and from the desert edge southward across immense distances. Whether every boundary detail was exact or not, the political message was unmistakable. The Göktürk state was being presented as the dominant organizing force beyond China's northern line. The cost of that dominance could be brutal. At one point, Mukan demanded the surrender of a refugee leader who had fled into Chinese hands. A Chinese official delivered the man and thousands of followers to the Göktürk envoys. They were executed. Later, Mukan requested passage through Chinese-controlled territory to strike the Tuyuhun. Permission was granted, and the campaign became a lesson in steppe warfare shaped by local intelligence. The force split into separate columns, aimed at two fortified places. One fortress held the Tuyuhun ruler. The other was defended by a senior official with several thousand men. The Göktürks captured the ruler's family in one siege, while their Chinese ally stormed the second stronghold and took its commander. When the armies reunited, Mukan publicly praised the decisive judgment he had witnessed, and rewarded it heavily. In this frontier world, alliances were not built on sentiment. They were built on results. By the early 560s, the struggle between China's northern dynasties and their rivals began to pull the Göktürks into a deeper game. The northern Zhou sought to coordinate attacks against the northern Qi, and marriage diplomacy became the bargaining chip. A Zhou delegation was sent to receive a Göktürk princess. When northern Qi panicked and offered its own gifts and proposals, Mukan hesitated, tempted by the larger payoff. The Zhou envoy reacted sharply, reminding him that earlier, Chinese rulers had honoured the Göktürks by returning refugees and maintaining good relations. The argument was framed as a moral warning as much as a political one. A ruler who forgot past obligations would answer not only to men, but to heaven. Mukan wavered, then agreed to proceed with the Zhou marriage. The envoys were spared, and the alliance moved forward. A joint offensive followed. Zhou forces advanced with Göktürk cavalry in separate columns, striking multiple fortresses. The campaign moved under harsh winter conditions, with deep snow flattening the landscape into a dangerous, open plain. Northern Qi's ruler withdrew to strongpoints, and a siege formed around a key city. Yet the steppe cavalry, confronted by defenders who refused to break, became cautious. A Zhou commander warned that pushing disciplined troops too far in heavy snow risked catastrophe. When the defenders surged out with noise and sudden aggression, the Göktürks pulled back toward higher ground, unwilling to commit. The result was a setback for the attackers. The Göktürks eventually withdrew, and on their departure they allowed extensive plunder across a wide zone. Reports describe a devastated corridor, emptied of people and animals. Even the retreat itself was harsh. Ice forced the use of felt mats to cross dangerous surfaces, and the horses suffered so badly in the cold that many died before the force reached the wall line again. This was the environment in which the northern Chinese courts tried to survive. War made unpredictable by weather, politics made unstable by shifting loyalties. Northern Qi, frightened by the pressure, attempted to buy time through concessions, sending relatives and promises and appealing for friendship. Diplomacy and fear flowed in both directions. The Göktürks themselves also began to court Qi directly, sending envoys and starting a formal relationship that kept every Chinese ruler guessing which way steppe power would turn next. Inside the steppe camp, even nature seemed to become an omen. When Mukan delayed sending the promised princess to Zhou, a violent snowstorm tore down tents and shattered the camp for days. He interpreted the disaster as a sign of divine disapproval, then finally prepared the marriage and released the envoys. As the decade turned, leadership shifted again. Mukan died, and before his death he set aside his own son and appointed his brother Tiapo as khagan. Authority was then distributed across the Göktürk world, with different branches of the royal family holding the east and west under separate titles. The arrangement contained the seeds of rivalry. While the Göktürk center enjoyed luxury and steady flows of Chinese silk, Chinese courts watched nervously and competed with each other to avoid becoming the next target. One source preserves a boast attributed to Tiapo. Both Chinese states were described as southern sons, loyal yet poor, a condescending image that reflected how confidently the steppe ruler now spoke. The collapse of northern Qi pushed the relationship into darker territory. Qi loyalists fled north and tried to rebuild under Göktürk protection. One claimant was elevated with the help of Göktürk troops, and his supporters spoke as if a new restoration had begun. The steppe rulers used this chaos as leverage, alternating between sheltering fugitives, extracting concessions, and raiding Zhou borderlands. Raids struck deep, civilians were killed or taken, and provinces were forced into emergency repairs along the wall and its passes. Even when peace talks opened, they often demanded hostages and royal marriages as the price. When Tiapo fell ill and died, the succession crisis split the steppe leadership. A son was asked to yield the throne to another branch, yet the elite rejected one candidate on the grounds that his maternal status lacked prestige. Another figure, Shitu, rose by force of reputation and threat. He presented himself as the man who could either obey loyally or defend the realm with steel, depending on who was chosen. Under that pressure, Anlo took the throne, but stability did not return. Rival claimants undermined him, and the royal council turned again to Shitu. He became khagan under the title Shapolue and established himself at Otuken. Other claimants settled elsewhere, declaring themselves secondary khagans, and the Steppe Empire effectively became a multi-centered system, with rulers stationed in different directions and bound together by fragile agreement. At the same moment, China's dynasty changed. The Sui rose, and in the steppe camp the old resentments did not vanish. A princess tied to the fallen Zhou house urged revenge, pressing Shapolue to strike the new regime. Raids escalated. Chinese garrisons were overrun, commanders were defeated, and Göktürk forces moved along multiple routes into frontier commanderies, seizing livestock and stripping the countryside. Yet internal fractures were widening inside the Göktürk leadership as well. Rival figures in the west gained strength, and the Sui court learned to treat division as a weapon. A Chinese strategist, Chang Sun Sheng, studied the steppe world closely, using personal access and intelligence gathered during time spent among the Göktürks. Reports sent to the Sui ruler argued that open war was not always the best answer. The steppe rulers distrusted each other, envied each other, feared each other. If those tensions were carefully exploited, the Göktürks could be pushed into fighting themselves. The plan aimed to be patient and cold, align with the weaker against the stronger, build contacts with Western rivals, draw in neighbouring tribes, and let suspicion do the work that armies could not. The Sui ruler accepted the logic and began acting on it, sending symbols of honour, arranging diplomatic seating meant to insult one envoy while elevating another, and distributing gifts designed to pull loyalties apart. Military pressure continued on the ground. In 582 and 583, a series of Sui counterattacks struck Göktürk forces in multiple locations. Some Chinese commanders proposed bold surprise raids with small elite cavalry, rather than slow defensive marches. In at least one battle, the Göktürk khagan fled so quickly that he threw away precious clothing and armour, and his army suffered from hunger and disease. Meanwhile, a Göktürk-backed Chinese ally was driven from his strongholds and eventually killed after fleeing into the steppe world. Peace envoys came and went, yet the Sui court refused to accept terms that would leave the frontier permanently vulnerable. Even in moments of apparent unity, the Göktürk leadership was breaking along family lines. Shapolue, jealous of a rival branch, struck at his opponents with shocking brutality, seizing and killing the mother of a competing khagan. The rival fled west to Tardu, whose anger turned into a major mobilization. Tens of thousands of horsemen gathered, battles followed, and the western side regained territory and influence. Another allied ruler, isolated by Shah Polu's moves, also fled west. A further branch rebelled and joined the opposition. The Steppe Empire, once presented as a single overwhelming power, was now visibly segmented into competing centres. Against this backdrop, the Sui court chose a different kind of victory: ritual submission. When Shah Polu, weakened by defeats, requested a marriage alliance, the Sui agreed, while reshaping the relationship on its own terms. Titles were adjusted, envoys were sent with stern instructions, and the steppe ruler was forced into a public display of deference. The scene was staged to make the message unmistakable. The khagan initially refused to rise, claiming that his ancestors had never bowed before any man. His wife, the princess, tried to smooth the conflict by warning that he was fierce by nature and hardened by endless struggle. A Chinese officer pressed harder, reminding him that marriage made him the emperor's son-in-law and that respect was therefore unavoidable. In the end, the khagan stood, lowered his head, and accepted the imperial letter in a posture of submission. The spectators, according to the account, were shaken by humiliation and wept openly. The demand that followed was blunt. Declare vassal status in the language of the Sui court. The khagan hesitated, asked how such words could even be spoken, then repeated them as his attendants instructed. Gifts were exchanged afterward, horses offered, marriages arranged, yet the political meaning had been set in public. The steppe ruler had been compelled to acknowledge the Sui emperor as superior in a formal, witnessed way. A long period of tension had already formed among the Göktürks. A deep rift existed between the western ruler, Apo Kagjan, and the eastern ruler, Shabolue. Over time, Apo gathered strength rapidly, expanding like a rising flood. He pushed eastward and seized control of Tuchin, then turned west and crossed the Altai Mountains. Kucha, Turfan, Hami, and the wider western regions, including the Sogdian cities, fell under his authority. From this moment on, these territories were known collectively as the Western Göktürk realm. The Sui court responded by sending a high-ranking general as an envoy to Apo. He was formally recognized and treated with honor. Yet this balance did not last long. In the 7th month of autumn, Chaboluos found himself under intense pressure from Tardu. Fear spread among neighboring peoples. Envoys rushed to the Sui court, reporting that Chabolway was in serious danger and requesting permission to move south of the desert with his followers. The Sui ruler approved and ordered military escorts, supplies, wagons, and attendants to be provided. Once stabilized, Chabolway launched a counterattack westward against Apo. The assault was swift and devastating. Apo's forces collapsed, his lands emptied, and his household was attacked. A surprise strike carried out, with Chinese involvement, sealed his defeat. Apo was captured alive, along with his family and supporters. Chabolway, now triumphant, extended his authority deep into the northern wilderness, where the desert itself became the frontier. An embassy was dispatched to the Sui emperor, declaring absolute submission. The message emphasized that just as there cannot be two suns in the sky, there could not be two supreme rulers on earth. The Sui emperor was acknowledged as the sole legitimate authority. Tribute followed, and regular gifts continued year after year. After Chabolway's death, mourning was observed even at the Sui court. His succession, however, sparked another internal crisis. His son was considered weak, and leadership passed instead to his brother, who assumed the title Baga Khagan. This transition did not occur without resistance, but tradition ultimately prevailed. The new ruler acted decisively, launching a sudden western strike that once again targeted Apo's remnants. Apo was captured and presented as a political dilemma to the Chinese court. Chinese officials debated whether he should be executed publicly or eliminated quietly. In the end, they chose not to intervene directly, allowing internal Göktürk divisions to weaken themselves. This strategy proved effective. The Göktürk world fractured further as brothers turned against one another and rival factions collapsed under their own weight. Baga Khagan's reign ended abruptly when he was killed during a western campaign. Power passed again, and instability deepened. By the late 6th century, Göktürk involvement in Chinese military affairs was discussed but largely rejected, as their unfamiliarity with southern terrain was considered a liability. Over the following years, alliances shifted constantly. Refugees fled across borders, rebels sought asylum, and royal women became political leverage. Suspicion, betrayal, and espionage dominated relations between the Göktürks and the Sui court. Envoys were sent repeatedly, some with gifts, others with hidden instructions to gather intelligence. Eventually, one Göktürk ruler openly defied the Sui emperor, halting tribute and launching repeated border raids. Chinese responses became more aggressive. Military commanders were deployed along multiple fronts, while internal Göktürk informants reported movements and plans. Major confrontations followed, including surprise attacks, desert pursuits, and night maneuvers designed to exhaust nomadic cavalry. One Göktürk leader, facing total collapse, fled south with only a handful of riders. He reached Chinese territory not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. Instead of punishment, he received protection, gifts, and political rehabilitation. Entire tribes followed him into Chinese-controlled zones, where new settlements were constructed and populations were reorganized under imperial supervision. Water sources were poisoned during later campaigns, livestock perished, and panic spread through the steppes. Defeated groups retreated north, never again attempting large-scale raids. power shifted decisively. As years passed, internal revolts among the steppe people shattered the remaining unity of the Göktürks. Former allies turned against one another. Tribal confederations collapsed. Some leaders surrendered, others fled westward or disappeared into desert routes. By the early 7th century, the Sui court held overwhelming influence across the northern frontier. Göktürk leaders arrived at the capital in awe, expressing admiration for Chinese wealth, order, and ceremony. Some requested to adopt Chinese customs entirely. These requests were politely refused, but they revealed how deeply the balance of power had changed. Imperial tours were staged deliberately along the frontier to demonstrate authority. Vast ceremonial tents were erected. Massive banquets were held. Silk, livestock, music, and dancers filled the steppe with spectacle. Göktürk elites bowed, prostrated themselves, and offered tribute before the emperor's procession. Poems were recited. Rituals were observed. Roads were built across deserts and plains to mark imperial reach. The nomadic world watched as Chinese administration extended deeper than ever before. In the west, trade routes were mapped, kingdoms catalogued, and strategic corridors documented. Intelligence replaced conquest. Influence replaced occupation. Through calculated diplomacy, internal division, and selective military pressure, the Göktürk world was dismantled without a single decisive war. In the first month of spring in the 8th year, the emperor moved quickly to tighten control over the people tied to the western Göktürk ruler, Chulu. The population was broken into 3 separate groups to prevent any single camp from becoming too strong. Chulu's brother, Göktürk Shad, was assigned to live at Huining with more than 10,000 weakened followers, people who were no longer considered an immediate military threat. Another figure, the Prince Tegin Danai, was ordered to settle with a different group at Lukung. Chulu himself was kept close and under watch. He was told to follow the imperial inspection convoy with only 5 mounted men, a clear signal that trust was limited. At the same time, the court tried to bind him through ceremony and reward. A new khagan title was offered to him, and he was flooded with gifts and public respect, as if honor could replace independence. In the first month of spring in 613, unrest flared along the frontier. A rebel leader named Bai Yusuo led raids, seizing herds and property, then moved north and aligned himself with Göktürk forces. The region of Lungyu suffered repeated disruption. Officials dismissed him as nothing more than a common bandit, but his ability to link up with steppe power made him far more dangerous than the label suggested. The emperor had already tasked Pei Ju with calming Lungyu after disturbances around Huining, and now that assignment became urgent. Messages were also sent to the tribe of a Göktürk khagan to coordinate pressure on the border. Göktürk Shad proved useful to the court in another way. He struck the Tuyuhun, carried off plunder, and returned with substantial wealth. He reported the results directly, and the emperor rewarded him generously. This pattern repeated throughout the period. Raids and counter-raids were not only warfare, but a form of politics, a way to buy loyalty with spoils and punish disobedience without open declaration. By the first month of 615, the crisis had widened. One rebel leader, Wei Taoer, proclaimed himself a ruler under a new title. Another warlord, Wang Shiba, gathered a force said to exceed 100,000. Both groups sought strength through alliances with the Göktürks. They turned south and pushed into the territories of Yan and Zhao, treating the frontier as a gateway rather than a wall. Later that year, in the 8th month of autumn, the emperor began an inspection tour of the northern borderlands. Before the journey, Pei Ju submitted a plan meant to weaken the growing power of Shibi Khagan by splitting his authority from within. The idea was simple and ruthless. Bring Shibi's brother, Chichi Shad, into the imperial family through marriage and recognize him as a southern khagan, a rival center of legitimacy. Chichi did not dare accept. When Shibi learned of the proposal, his anger was immediate. At that time, a vassal serving the Göktürks, Shushuhusi, was known for careful planning and had risen high in Shibi's confidence. Peiju drew him out with the promise of trade and a border market, used him as a guide beyond the defences of Mai, and then had him killed. Afterward, an envoy was sent to Shibi, claiming that Shishuhusi had defected to China and been executed as punishment. Shibi understood the truth. He refused to appear at the Chinese court, and instead prepared a direct strike. With a force said to be several 100,000 cavalry, he aimed to ambush the imperial convoy during the inspection. A warning reached the emperor in time, carried through the channels of a princess connected to the steppe world. The emperor withdrew at speed and took refuge inside the fortress of Yanmen. Reinforcements moved to protect nearby positions, but the storm broke quickly. Göktürk forces surrounded Yanmen. Panic spread through the region. People locked themselves indoors and braced for collapse. Inside the fortress, there were only about 150 soldiers and civilians capable of defense, and food supplies were estimated to last roughly 20 days. The wider defensive network around Yanmen included 41 forts. The Göktürks seized 39 of them. Only Yanmen and a single supporting fort held out. The attackers pressed close enough to send arrows and spears toward the area where the emperor sheltered. Fear became visible at the top. Witnesses described the emperor clinging to a prince, openly weeping, his eyes swollen from stress. Advisors argued in urgent tones. One general urged a breakout with several thousand cavalry, cutting through the siege before the ring tightened. Others insisted the fortress could hold, that trained light cavalry and regional commanders still existed, and that movement should not be rushed. Another voice demanded a far broader response. Call up troops from across the realm, bring the emperor into direct contact with the army to restore morale, and make it clear that the state would not retreat again toward Liaodong. A different advisor pointed to the steppe tradition itself, reminding the court that the Khatun often understood strategy, and that the princess who sent warning was linked to both worlds. An appeal to her influence, even if it failed, would cost little and might save everything. It was also suggested that external enemies be publicly pardoned to steady popular confidence, so that civilians would fight instead of despair. The emperor accepted the advice to send aid requests through the princess's channels. At the same time, he tried to stabilize the defenders through rewards. Silk was distributed according to rank, with greater amounts promised to officials and smaller, but still meaningful rewards promised to men without title. The aim was simple: turn fear into effort. Even so, the siege was brutal. Night plans were drawn up, but many defenders were wounded or killed during constant pressure. Across the empire, emergency orders went out. Even those not normally assigned to military service were called up. Units raced toward the frontier, competing to reach the threatened zone first. Among those drawn into the moment was a young man of 16, the son of Li Yuan, who sought to raise support from a border commander. A plan was proposed to create the illusion of a massive relief force. March quickly, fly banners, beat drums through the night, and let the steppe scouts report that huge armies were arriving. It was a gamble, because if the deception failed, a small force would be swallowed. But the commander agreed. A secret envoy again reached the princess, and she warned Shibi that a fresh crisis was developing on the northern frontier. Relief troops from the eastern capital and many regions converged toward Shinku. In the 9th month, Shibi lifted the siege and withdrew. Imperial officials sent scouts into the surrounding landscape. The valleys and mountains were empty. The raiders had vanished. A pursuit force was dispatched, and 2,000 elderly and weakened Göktürk stragglers were captured and brought back. The border did not settle. Trade and steppe diplomacy continued to clash with imperial control. When officials learned that markets were being established with Göktürk groups, anger rose at the highest level. Raids resumed again and again. Li Yuan was ordered to command forces along the Taiyuan route, and a local judge in Mai was directed to meet the threat. Their combined forces were small, barely reaching 5,000 at times. Li Yuan selected 2,000 skilled archers and riders, trained them to survive and move in steppe style, and drilled them to resemble the enemy in pace and posture. In skirmishes, this sometimes worked. When the maneuver succeeded, Göktürk riders hesitated, uncertain of what they faced. By 617, the political ground was breaking apart. In the 2nd month, a frontier general murdered the deputy governor, seized the province, and proclaimed himself chief minister. He immediately sought Göktürk support. In the 3rd month, forces linked to Wuchu and the Göktürks struck a city, killed its defender, and drove another official to flee back toward Yanmen. Wuchu then attacked Lukung, entered Fengyangguan, and seized what the region once treated as a northern imperial center. Captured palace women were sent to Shibi as tribute, and Shibi returned horses in exchange. Wuchu's power grew. He struck Tingjiang, and the Göktürks elevated him with a regional khagan title and sent a wolf-headed banner, a symbol meant to make his authority feel inevitable. Other warlords followed the same pattern, aligning themselves with steppe power to strengthen their claims over Chinese territory. Li Yuan attempted to hold Mai, but could not stop all pressure. Even when resistance held, the cost was heavy, and fear ran through the cities. In one major incident, Göktürk cavalry swept into Qinyang, entered through the northern gate, and exited through the eastern gate, striking fast and leaving before a full response formed. Li Yuan ordered troops to prepare, but also did something unexpected. He ordered the city gates opened. The attackers, unable to understand the trap or the confidence behind it, refused to commit and pulled away. Later, betrayal within the city was punished publicly. Executions were carried out in full view. Another force sent out to fight was wiped out. Deepening panic inside the walls. That night, Li Yuan moved troops outside the city, hung banners high, and had drums beaten until dawn. From a distance, it sounded like reinforcements arriving. The Göktürks hesitated, looted the outskirts for 2 days, then withdrew. As the situation escalated, advisors urged Li Yuan to deal directly with Shibi. They argued that horses were the key. Even if steppe soldiers were not needed, steppe horses could decide everything. Li Yuan began preparing gifts and sent a message to Shibi promising alliance and wealth, but asking that steppe forces not harm civilians if they moved south. Shibi's response showed calculation. He recognized the Sui ruler had been weakened by his own people. If Li Yuan became the new son of heaven, it would be wiser to assist him than to oppose him. Messages travelled at remarkable speed. Generals celebrated, demanding the agreement be accepted. Li Yuan hesitated, then conceded, believing there was no clean alternative. Göktürk envoys arrived with 1,000 horses. Their leader was received with formal honours and lifted by ceremony. The best horses were selected. Many Göktürks remained at the market, while Chinese volunteers tried to bargain aggressively. Li Yuan stopped them, insisting that greed would destroy the relationship and that scarcity should be displayed on purpose to keep the steppe allies eager rather than arrogant. When the envoys returned north, Li Yuan sent Liu Wenqing as his own emissary to request military assistance. He also gave a private warning. When steppe cavalry enter Chinese territory, locals often provoke them, and uncontrolled contact could turn allies into predators. In the 7th month, a Western Göktürk figure, Ashina Danai, led his people to follow the Tang Revolutionary Army as it advanced. Soon after, Liu Wenqing met Shibi in the steppe camp and repeated the promise. If Chang'an fell, the realm would submit to the Tang Duke, and the Göktürks would be rewarded with gold, jade, and vast quantities of silk. Shibi welcomed the offer. He dispatched a senior minister to Li Yuan's camp and declared that the approaches and routes would be protected. Meanwhile, the steppe world itself fractured. Juedu Shad seized Huining Chuan, proclaimed himself khagan, and sought alliance. In the 8th month, Li Yuan reached Lungmen. Liu Wenqing returned alongside a Göktürk envoy and a small force of 500 men, bringing 2,000 horses. Li Yuan greeted the assistance with visible relief. The army was still short of soldiers, but rich in mounts, and that imbalance shaped the campaign's next phase. As the march continued westward toward the river, the arrival of steppe support became a signal to every prince and commander. The struggle was entering a new stage where legitimacy, speed, and cavalry mattered as much as walls and titles.